For a lot of people, I think their biggest fear when it comes to the war in Ukraine is the potential for nuclear escalation. This is, of course, a very scary scenario, potentially, in the minds of some, a world-ending scenario that makes it seem incredibly risky for any country to intervene and provide aid to Ukraine to help them defeat Russia. That is a talking point and a thought process that has certainly been picked up in the media very frequently throughout this entire war. Early on in the war, for example, a lot of people were saying how we should not engage Russia at all because of the threat of nuclear war. There were several instances where Russia did seem to be threatening nuclear war and was setting red lines on European or American aid to Ukraine, and they said that they would escalate to nuclear war if those red lines were crossed. A lot of people, when the United States provided long-range missiles to Ukraine, complained that the presidential administration at that time was being reckless and risking nuclear warfare. And it goes on and on and on and on. People are genuinely afraid of this. However, I have been following the war in Ukraine for several years now. I have been engaging with the day-by-day events of the war, and I have been analyzing the nuclear question inside and out from every angle possible. And surprise, surprise, I have developed a different and I think much more well-rounded and more accurate perspective on the nuclear question than a lot of the analysts or news talking heads who only engage with the war in Ukraine when it seems like there is a headline-capturing moment. For people whose job is to engage the news in that way, it's not surprising to me at all that they would latch on to the nuclear threat as a very scary potential, because on its surface, that is, of course, how it at first looks, until you analyze it deeper. And if that is not your job, you may never actually do that. I also think there are a lot of people who have incentives to make the nuclear threat seem more scary than it really is for various reasons. I'm not going to rant on and get all into that. But what I want to present in this video is a conclusion that I think is incredibly important, which is why I think it actually makes nuclear war less likely if people support Ukraine and oppose Russia than the opposite, which is very different from what you will hear most people say. Now, I have a full-length video already where I dive very in-depth into Russia's nuclear capabilities and whether they are as good as they actually say. I go into the psychology of nuclear weapons, I go into the budget that Russia actually has to use their nuclear weapons, and the tactical and the strategic way nuclear warfare would actually occur to kind of demonstrate a lot of my thought process behind why I do not think nuclear war is a likely outcome if the US or if Europe engages with Russia to defeat it in Ukraine. I'm not going to repeat all that information there, but you can go and watch that video. But I will summarize it as this. There is a lot of value in a nuclear weapon when you use it to threaten people. There is very limited value in a nuclear weapon when you actually use it against people. And because of this, it is not surprising at all why a nuclear power like Russia would constantly wave their nuclear weapons around and threaten to use them over and over and over and over again. But it would be incredibly surprising if they actually used a nuclear weapon, because it is not in their interest in any way whatsoever to do that. And that has proven itself across the battlefield in Ukraine over the course of several years. It is no longer just a theory at this point, because Russia has set several so-called red lines after which they would engage in nuclear warfare. Those red lines were very cautiously approached, very cautiously analyzed, and then ultimately crossed, and Russia, surprise, surprise, never launched a nuke. But what Russia did get was they did get a lot of time to conduct actions on the battlefield without as significant support for Ukraine as there could have been, because the nuclear threat and the fear that it created worked. So that being the case in Ukraine is part of the reason why I think it is actually much more risky to not support Ukraine and to listen to Russia's nuclear threats than to support Ukraine and to not listen to Russia's nuclear threats. And the reason for that is because while on the surface it seems like we are avoiding nuclear war, what we are actually doing is just encouraging nuclear proliferation. And in particular, we are encouraging nuclear proliferation among countries that are even more radicalized than Russia. I know it's hard to believe, but they do exist. Countries like Iran, countries like North Korea, other countries that want to be like Iran or North Korea, who have ideological reasons to potentially use a nuclear weapon in a way that is not in their own benefit. That is the scary piece, because every time that we cave into a nuclear threat from Russia, a nuclear threat that Russia does not follow through on, we show the value in acquiring a nuclear weapon. What it looks like to the outside world when the Western world backs down every time that Russia waves around a nuke is, hey, you know what? If I got a nuclear weapon, even though I am a tiny nation that could easily be crushed, because if you look at Russia right now, if the West intervened, they could easily be crushed. A lot of countries are thinking, well, if they're not going to attack Russia, even though they could be easily crushed, maybe they won't attack us, even though we could be easily crushed if we only have a nuclear weapon. That encourages nuclear proliferation. That encourages the countries that acquire these nuclear weapons to do terrible things in their regions of the world and probably get away with it if this line of thought is consistently pursued. And then ultimately, because it results in more radicalized people getting their hands on nuclear weapons, the risk of nuclear war goes way, way up, because a lot of the reasons that I've analyzed in my other full-length video on why Russia would not use a nuclear weapon would not apply to a radicalized, smaller, more regional power. Now, there is a massive irony in all of this, and that, unfortunately, comes back to Donald Trump. And I know I get it, I'm going to get comments saying I have TDS. Unfortunately, guys, this is a geopolitics channel, which means that I have to analyze the actions of all the important players, and right now Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And if I disagree with something he does on the geopolitical landscape, I unfortunately have to say that. And it's not because I'm trying to just attack everything he does, it's because that is my job. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump, there is a massive irony in his nuclear approach. Because when it comes to Russia, when Donald Trump was campaigning, he talked a lot about how everybody forgets that Russia has nuclear weapons, and we should be careful when it comes to supporting Ukraine because Russia has nukes. Now, simultaneously, Donald Trump is currently, as I speak, as I'm making this video, negotiating a nuclear non-proliferation deal with Iran. What we see here is a very inconsistent strategy. We are trying to convince Iran that it is not in their best interests to get a nuclear weapon, while showing them through our actions and the way that we behave towards Russia that actually it might be in their interests. This is the problem with attitudes that want to push for peace without understanding that sometimes to acquire peace, you must also have strength. This is why we need to think carefully about things when it comes to geopolitics and war, because the world is far bigger than just one region, and the choices we make, if we are inconsistent, can undermine our strategy in another area. It is very difficult. It takes a lot of work to connect all the dots and to have a consistent strategy and a consistent narrative, but it must be done. Now, speaking of cause and effect, there is one other way that supporting Ukraine will help stop nuclear proliferation. And in this case, it actually comes down to nuclear proliferation in Ukraine itself. When it comes to Ukraine, they have a history with nuclear weapons. They, of course, were part of the Soviet Union, and as part of the Soviet Union, they were a part where they did much of the nuclear research and much of the nuclear development. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the Western world and also Russia not the entire Western world, but the United States, the UK, I think a couple other nations, I can't remember all of them, and Russia, were very nervous that Ukraine had so many nuclear weapons. Ukraine was actually the third largest nuclear power in the world at that time. And so they all got together and they convinced Ukraine to give their nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security guarantees. Basically, if a nuclear power ever attacks you, we will protect you. That, of course, did not happen. And right now, as Ukraine is being continuously attacked by Russia and not getting the guarantees that they were promised, they are obviously asking themselves the question of whether they would have been better off if they had kept their nuclear weapons as a deterrent against invasion. Now, simultaneously, Ukraine is trying to pursue a different kind of security guarantee. They are trying to get included in NATO, or at least in the European Union, something that will guarantee to them that if they are attacked, other nations will come to their aid because they are fighting this war with Russia that is protecting basically all of Europe, and they are bearing the brunt of the costs. Ukraine has been consistently told that joining NATO is pretty much off the table by both their Western partners and by Russia. And so Ukraine is now having to ask itself the question of, well, if we can't protect ourselves that way, we have to take care of our own security. We can't rely on anybody else. The only way to do that is to develop nuclear capabilities. And for Ukraine to develop nuclear capabilities is not outside of the realm of possibilities at all. Ukraine, of course, as I said, was part of the Soviet Union. That is where a lot of the nuclear research, a lot of the nuclear development happened. Ukraine, no doubt, still has documents about nukes that they could use to help them in their own nuclear program. And there have been a lot of estimates that if Ukraine really wanted to get nukes, they could do so within either a matter of months or a matter of years. So the longer that we try to not support Ukraine because we are afraid of nuclear warfare, ironically, all we do is cause more nuclear proliferation. And that's not a problem right now. I actually personally right now, I would 100% trust Ukraine with nuclear weapons. But again, with nuclear proliferation in general, the idea is that you don't know what the next generation is going to do. And so in general, the world is trying to have nuclear non-proliferation, lower the amount of nukes all over the world so that you can lower the chance of error and nuclear warfare actually happening. In all of these ways, by not supporting Ukraine, we are making nuclear warfare either now or in the future more and more likely every single day. So you can see in this video how geopolitics is very complex, very multifaceted, and not very intuitive the first time you approach it, and it's easy to get things wrong. And I don't blame people for getting it wrong when it comes to Russian nukes, at least your average person. The unfortunate fact, though, is that Russia knows all of this, and Russia takes advantage of this complexity to intentionally confuse them and send them down the wrong trail. I already talked about how Russia uses propaganda about nukes, and not just nukes, but super weapons, all sorts of crazy stuff, to scare people away from taking action against them, because the threat helps their war effort, even if they will never actually use a nuke. For that reason, it is very important for people to have access to information and opportunities to arrive at conclusions that are different from those that Russia is just feeding to them. Now, that is why I do what I do on this particular YouTube channel. And if you appreciate that approach, before you go, can I ask you for a quick favor? Would you consider becoming a patron of this channel and supporting more of this work? It's completely voluntary, but it just helps me in my efforts to produce more videos and hopefully get more important information to more people. If you want to learn more about that, you can scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you want more information on why Russia's nukes aren't as scary as most people think, be sure to watch the video on screen. I will see you guys on the next one.